Imagine spending 3 years, thousands of engineering hours, and the combined industrial might of a nation at war, all to build a weapon so powerful, so advanced, that military planners genuinely believed it could end the war on its own. Imagine the factories running day and night. Imagine the test crews shaking their heads in disbelief at what this machine could do. Imagine the generals rubbing their hands together, finally confident they had something that could punch through anything the enemy threw at them. And then imagine it arriving just weeks too late. That is not a Hollywood script. That is not some alternate history novel. That is the real, documented, heartbreaking story of the A-41 Centurion, Britain's most ambitious tank project of the Second World War. And today, we're going to tell that story properly. Not the sanitized, 2-paragraph version you find in most history books. The full story. The messy story. The human story. Because here's the thing about the Centurion that most people completely miss. They look at this tank, they see its post-war success, they see Korea and the Sinai and Vietnam, and they nod and say, yes, fine tank, came a bit late, shame about that. And then they move on. But that summary does a massive disservice to what this vehicle actually represents. The Centurion is not just a tank that arrived too late. It is a window into everything that was wrong and eventually right about British tank design philosophy. It is the story of years of failure, years of frustration, years of British tank crews climbing into machines that they quietly knew were not good enough. It is the story of engineers who kept pushing, kept arguing, kept insisting that they could do better, even when nobody in authority wanted to listen. It is, in many ways, the most British military story ever told. So settle in. This is going to take a while. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at the Centurion or British armored history quite the same way again. To understand the Centurion, you have to understand where Britain was coming from. And where Britain was coming from, in terms of tank design, was a very complicated and frankly quite painful place. Britain invented the tank. Let that sink in for a moment. The nation that gave the world the modern battle tank, that sent lumbering, terrifying steel monsters crawling across the mud of the Somme in 1916 and genuinely changed the nature of warfare forever. That nation spent the better part of the 1930s and early 1940s producing armored vehicles that, to be charitable, were deeply underwhelming. Why? How does a country go from inventing something to being so far behind in its development? The answer is complicated, and it involves money, doctrine, bureaucracy, and a peculiarly British tendency to overcommittee everything until the original idea has been argued into a pale shadow of itself. In the interwar years, the British Army developed a theory about tanks that seemed perfectly logical at the time. They decided that tanks had 2 jobs. The first job was infantry support, slow, heavily armored vehicles that would crawl alongside the foot soldiers, crushing wire, knocking out machine gun nests, and generally making life easier for the men on the ground. The second job was exploitation, fast, lightly armored cavalry tanks that would punch through gaps in the enemy line and race into the rear areas, causing chaos and disruption. 2 jobs, 2 types of tank. Perfectly logical, perfectly tidy, and in practice a complete disaster. The infantry tanks, the Matilda, the Valentine, the Churchill, were often well-armored but criminally slow and generally undergunned. The cruiser tanks, the Crusader, the Cromwell, the Comet, were faster but often unreliable and again, frequently struggling with their armament when it came to dealing with the heavier German vehicles. Meanwhile, the Germans had looked at their own tank doctrine and, particularly after Poland and France, had started to converge on a simpler, more ruthless philosophy. One good tank, properly armed, properly armored, reliable enough to actually get to the fight. The Panzer IV, progressively upgraded throughout the war, became a genuinely capable all-rounder. And then, of course, there was the Panther and the Tiger. British tank crews in the Western Desert, in Italy, in Normandy, they knew when they were outgunned. They knew when their rounds were bouncing off the front of a Panther at ranges where the Panther's gun was cutting through them like tinfoil. They knew, and they had to fight anyway, and many of them died because of decisions made by people who were nowhere near the battlefield. There was a dark, bitter joke that circulated among British armored units. They said that the Sherman, which they received in large numbers from America, and which, compared to some of the earlier British designs, felt almost luxurious. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lit first time, every time. That tells you everything you need to know about the morale situation inside British armored units by the middle years of the war. By 1943, the British Army was in the middle of a genuine armored design crisis, and at least some of the people in positions of authority were starting to acknowledge it. The Cromwell was coming into service. It was fast, genuinely fast, and more reliable than many of its predecessors. But it was armed with a 75mm gun that, while adequate against most German armor at reasonable ranges, was going to struggle badly against the newer, heavier German vehicles that intelligence reports were confirming were on the way. And then came Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. And what came out of Kursk from the German side were not just lessons about tactics or logistics. What came out of Kursk was the confirmation that the Tiger and the Panther were both in full production and being deployed in serious numbers. British tank designers looked at those reports. They looked at the projected armor thickness of the Panther, 80mm on the front glacis, sloped to give effective protection far exceeding that raw number. They looked at the Tiger's 100mm of flat frontal armor, and they looked at what their current and planned tanks were carrying in terms of guns. And there were some very quiet, very uncomfortable conversations in the offices of the War Office and the various tank design establishments. The decision that emerged from those conversations, and it was not a cleaned, decisive decision. It was the kind of messy, compromise-ridden decision that British military procurement seemed almost genetically inclined to produce, was that something new was needed. Not an upgrade, not a modification, something genuinely new. The specification that was drawn up in the autumn of 1943 was, by the standards of what had gone before, almost shockingly ambitious. The new tank had to carry a high-velocity gun capable of defeating any known or projected German armor. It had to have armor that could resist the standard German anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. And it had to be reliable, genuinely, mechanically reliable in a way that so many British designs had failed to be. There was also a deliberate decision to abandon the old infantry tank and cruiser tank distinction completely. The new vehicle would be a universal tank, one machine that could do every job. This was, intellectually, a significant leap for British armor doctrine. The old two-category system had become almost sacred in some parts of the establishment. Getting rid of it was not just a technical decision. It was a philosophical one. The project was given to AEC, the Associated Equipment Company, working in collaboration with other elements of the British tank design community. The project was codenamed A41. The design process for the A41 was, by British wartime standards, remarkably focused. Part of that was genuine urgency. Everyone involved understood that time mattered. Part of it was that the failure of previous designs had created a kind of collective determination not to repeat the same mistakes. The armor specification was settled first because it was considered the most critical. The requirement was for frontal armor capable of resisting the 88mm gun, the weapon that had been killing British tanks since North Africa, that had destroyed more Allied armor than any other single weapon system, and that was now mounted in Tigers and in the dreaded 88mm anti-tank gun that German forces positioned with ruthless skill. The solution was elegant, and it borrowed ideas that the designers had been watching develop in German and Soviet tanks for some time. The glacis plate, the front sloped section of the hull, would be heavily armored and angled at a significant slope. Sloping armor was not a new concept. The Soviets had been doing it brilliantly since the T-34. But the British had been slow to fully embrace it, partly because of the constraints imposed by the old infantry tank and cruiser tank specifications. With those gone, the designers could finally do what the physics had always been telling them to do. The turret was another story entirely. The turret of the A41 was designed from the beginning to accept a range of different main guns, a deliberate design flexibility that reflected the lessons of watching previous British tanks become outdated almost as soon as they entered service. The initial armament planned was the Ordnance QF 17-pounder, the 76.2mm high-velocity gun that had proven, when fitted to the Sherman Firefly, that British designers could produce genuinely excellent anti-tank weapons when they were given the freedom to do so. The 17-pounder in the A41 was not a retrofit. It was not a compromise. It was built into the design from the start, in a purpose-designed turret that gave the crew room to work, that protected the gun mechanism properly, and that allowed reasonable ammunition stowage. Anyone who had seen the contortions required to fit the 17-pounder into the Sherman Firefly, a job that required a major redesign of the turret and the removal of the co-driver, could appreciate what a difference that starting from scratch approach made. The engine chosen was the Rolls-Royce Meteor, the same power plant that, in modified form, had proven itself in the Cromwell. It was derived from the legendary Merlin Arrow engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane. In a tank, with the supercharger removed and the compression ratio adjusted, it produced around 600 horsepower. For a vehicle of the Centurion's weight, that gave a reasonable power-to-weight ratio. Not as sprightly as the Cromwell, but enough for a credible cross-country performance. And then there was the transmission. British tanks had, historically, had a difficult relationship with their transmissions. The Merritt Brown gearbox, which was used in the Churchill and had been refined over several years, was one of the better British designs, but it had its limitations. The A41 designers worked hard on the drivetrain, understanding that a tank that broke down before it reached the battle was worse than useless. The first prototypes began taking shape in early 1944, and what emerged from the workshops was, by all accounts, a genuinely impressive piece of engineering. The profile was low and purposeful. The sloped hull was immediately recognizable as a step forward from the more vertical faces of earlier British designs. The turret was large and well-shaped, with the commander's cupola that gave good all-round visibility, something that British tank commanders have been crying out for since the early days of the war. The test crews who first drove the prototypes reported something that British tank men had rarely been able to say about a homegrown design. They said it felt right. It felt solid. It felt like a machine that had been designed by people who understood what tank crews actually needed, rather than by committees who had never been closer to a tank than the pages of a specification document. Testing continued through 1944. There were problems. There always are with any new design. The suspension needed work. Some of the automotive components required revision. The gun mantlet, the armored shield around the gun where it met the turret, went through several iterations before the designers were satisfied. These were not catastrophic problems. They were the normal growing pains of any serious engineering project, and they were dealt with one by one with a methodical thoroughness that was genuinely encouraging. By late 1944, the A41 was looking like it might actually deliver on its promise. 6 pre-production prototypes had been built, and they were being put through an increasingly demanding program of trials. The 17-pounder was performing exactly as hoped. The armor was proving itself in ballistic tests. The Meteor engine in the Centurion's installation was showing the kind of reliability that had been so painfully absent from so many earlier British designs. Word was spreading through the armored community. Something good was coming. Something that might, finally, give British tank crews the machine they deserved. But the war was not waiting. In June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion in history, put hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles onto the beaches of France. Among those vehicles were Churchills and Cromwells and Shermans. Good tanks and not-so-good tanks, and tanks that were adequate for some purposes but worrying against the best German armor. The fighting in Normandy was brutal, attritional, and deeply expensive in terms of armored vehicles. The bocage country, the dense network of hedgerows and sunken lanes that covered so much of the Norman landscape, was almost perfectly designed to negate the advantages of Allied numbers and mobility. Tanks that tried to push through a hedgerow exposed their belly armor to any German anti-tank weapon waiting on the other side. Tanks that tried to go around found themselves channeled into killing grounds. And in the hedgerows and the ruins of Norman villages, the Tigers and Panthers and late-model Panzer IVs exacted a terrible toll. There are accounts from British tank commanders in Normandy that are almost unbearable to read. Men who knew they were sending their crews into engagements they could not win, who watched their tanks brew up one after another, who continued to fight because there was nothing else to do. The courage was extraordinary. The equipment too often was not. The A-41 was not ready for Normandy. It was not ready for the breakout operations of late summer 1944. It was not ready for the desperate fighting around Arnhem, where British paratroopers held on for 9 days against overwhelming odds and waited for a relief force that arrived too late and too weak. It was not ready for the crossing of the Rhine in early 1945. It was not ready for the final push into Germany, through the shattered industrial heartland of the Ruhr, through the burning cities and the surrendering garrisons and the disbelieving survivors of the concentration camps. By the time the first production Centurions were ready, fully ready, tested and accepted and shipped to the theater of operations, it was May 1945. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The Centurions arrived in Germany in the week following the German surrender, exactly when the crews and the commanders who had been waiting for them, waiting for something better, something that matched what the Germans had, exactly when those men had laid down their weapons and were trying to process the fact that they had survived. 6 Centurions made it to Europe before the end. 6 tanks, shipped across the channel with every urgency the logistical system could muster, arriving just days after the last shots were fired. Think about that. 6 tanks, days late. And here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because what happened next is not what most people expect. When you hear about a weapon that arrived too late for the war it was designed to fight, you generally expect one of 2 endings. Either the weapon is quietly forgotten, canceled, scrapped, reduced to a footnote in specialist histories, or it becomes one of those melancholy museum pieces that sits behind rope barriers and reminds visitors of what might have been. The Centurion got neither of those endings, because it turned out that the engineers and designers who had worked so hard on this machine had not just built a tank for one specific war. They had built something genuinely exceptional, a design so fundamentally sound, so thoughtfully conceived, so well balanced between competing requirements, that it would go on to serve in conflicts for the next 5 decades. The post-war years were, for the British Army, a period of rapid and sometimes brutal change. The empire was dissolving. The Cold War was beginning. The army was being cut, restructured, reorganized, and asked to do more with less in every theater from Malaya to Kenya to the Canal Zone. And through all of this, the Centurion was there. It entered full service with the British Army in 1946. The initial production vehicles were armed with the 17-pounder, and they were good, genuinely competitive against anything the Soviet Union was fielding in the immediate post-war years. But the designers had built that flexible turret for a reason, because they knew that armored warfare did not stand still. They knew that the 17-pounder, excellent as it was, would eventually be superseded. The answer was the Royal Ordnance L7, a 105mm rifle gun of extraordinary capability that would eventually arm not just the Centurion, but the American M60, the German Leopard 1, and a dozen other Western tank designs. Fitted to the Centurion in the mid-1950s, it transformed an already capable vehicle into something that could credibly threaten any tank in Soviet service. But the real test of the Centurion, the test that would settle, once and for all, the question of whether it was genuinely great or just theoretically promising, came not in the plains of Germany, but in the mountains of Korea. The Korean War began in June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove south with a speed and violence that shocked the Western powers. The initial United Nations response was largely American, and it was almost catastrophic. Under-equipped, under-trained forces trying to hold a shrinking perimeter while reinforcements were rushed from Japan and the United States. British forces arrived relatively early in the conflict, and with them came the Centurions of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars. Korea was not tank country. At least, that was what a lot of people assumed. The terrain was mountainous, the roads were poor, the winters were brutal, and the nature of the conflict, with its emphasis on holding ridgelines and fighting for individual hills, seemed to favor infantry and artillery over armor. Several senior commanders in the theater were initially skeptical about the value of tanks at all. The Centurion proved them wrong. What the Centurion demonstrated in Korea was something that its designers had always intended, but that had never been proven in actual combat. That a well-designed, properly armored, reliably mechanically sound tank could operate effectively in conditions that would have broken earlier British designs. The Centurions crossed terrain that their crews were told was impassable for tracked vehicles. They climbed gradients that seemed impossible for a vehicle of their weight. They operated through the Korean winter, which was genuinely vicious, with a reliability that left American observers, who were dealing with significant mechanical problems with their own armor, quietly impressed. And they fought. There are engagements from Korea that deserve to be far better known than they are. In the fighting around the Imjin River in April 1951, during the massive Chinese spring offensive that came close to breaking the UN line, Centurion crews fought defensive actions that were almost medieval in their intensity. Close-range, direct fire engagements against waves of infantry, supporting beleaguered infantry units, holding ground that needed to be held while the broader tactical situation was stabilized. The 8th Hussars, in particular, distinguished themselves in actions that would have made the old cavalry regiments of an earlier era proud. The tradition and the technology had finally come together in a way that worked. And the gun. The 17-pounder initially, later the 20-pounder, and then the L7, proved devastatingly effective against the North Korean and Chinese armor it encountered. The T-34, which the North Koreans had used to such good effect in the opening months of the war, was not a comfortable vehicle to be in when a Centurion had it in its sights. Korea wrote the Centurion's reputation in ink. When the armistice was signed in July 1953, the Centurion emerged from the conflict with a record that spoke for itself. It was reliable. It was lethal. It could be sustained in the field. And crucially, the crews believed in it. That last point matters more than it might seem. A tank that its crews trust is worth immeasurably more than a theoretically superior design that its operators approach with dread. From Korea, the Centurion's career only expanded. It was exported to Australia, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, India, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, and Israel, among others. Each of these nations found in the Centurion not just a capable tank, but a design that could be adapted, modified, and upgraded to meet their specific needs. Israel's experience with the Centurion deserved particular attention, because it represents one of the most demanding combat tests any tank design has ever been put through. The Israel Defense Forces received their first Centurions in the early 1960s, and the timing was significant. The IDF had learned from the Suez conflict in 1956 and from the constant low-level border warfare that characterized Israeli security in that era that they needed a main battle tank that could survive in a very specific kind of environment: hot, dusty with long engagement ranges across open desert terrain, and with the constant possibility of meeting Soviet-supplied armor operated by Arab armies that were receiving increasingly capable equipment. The Centurion, in Israeli hands, underwent a series of modifications that illustrated something important about the basic design. It could take improvement. The Israeli engineers, working with their characteristic combination of ingenuity and urgent practicality, addressed the Centurion's main weakness, its relatively high fuel consumption and the limited range that resulted, by retrofitting a new diesel engine. The Continental AVDS 1790, an American diesel, transformed the Centurion's operational range and addressed one of the few real criticisms that crews had consistently raised. The Israeli version, which they called the Shot, meaning whip in Hebrew, went on to fight in the Six-Day War of 1967, the war of attrition that followed, and most famously, the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. The Yom Kippur War was, in armored terms, one of the most intense conflicts of the entire Cold War period. Syrian and Egyptian forces, equipped with modern Soviet tanks and, critically, with large numbers of anti-tank guided missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, launched simultaneous surprise offensives against Israel. The scale of the armored battles in the first days of the war was genuinely staggering. On the Golan Heights, Israeli armored units, including Shot Centurions, faced Syrian tank forces of overwhelming numerical superiority. What happened on the Golan in those first desperate days has been analyzed and written about extensively, and we could spend another full video on just that campaign. But the short version is this. The Israeli tank crews, fighting with a ferocity born of the knowledge that if the Golan fell, the Syrian army would be driving down toward the Israeli heartland within hours, held. They held against numbers that should have overwhelmed them. Individual tank commanders made decisions and took actions that, under normal circumstances, would be described as suicidal. Tanks that were hit, repaired under fire, and sent back into action. Crew members who were wounded, bandaged by their comrades, and continued to fight. And through it all, the Centurion, the Shot, absorbed punishment that would have destroyed less capable designs and kept fighting. There are documented cases of Centurions taking multiple hits from Soviet-supplied anti-tank guided missiles and remaining in action. The armor that those designers in Britain had worked out so carefully back in 1943 and 1944 was still doing its job 30 years later. The Yom Kippur War is sometimes cited as the end of the tank's dominance on the battlefield, the moment when the anti-tank missile proved that armor was vulnerable. And there's something in that argument. The losses on both sides were catastrophic in armored terms. But what the war actually proved was more nuanced. It proved that tanks operated without proper combined arms support in terrain that favored the defender with anti-tank weapons could be destroyed in large numbers. It did not prove that the tank was obsolete. What it proved was that the tank needed to be part of a combined arms team. And in that combined arms team, the Centurion remained a valued member for years after Yom Kippur. The South African experience with the Centurion is another chapter that rarely gets the attention it deserves. South Africa operated Centurions, again in modified form, with engine upgrades and various local modifications, in the border wars of the 1970s and 1980s. The Elephant, as the South African version was known, fought in Angola against Cuban forces equipped with Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks. The engagements in Angola demonstrated that a well-maintained, crew-trusted Centurion derivative could hold its own against more modern Soviet-built armor in the hands of competent and motivated crews. The Elephant remained in service with the South African National Defense Force until well into the 21st century. Let that sink in. A design that originated in 1943 that was built to fight in the Second World War, that arrived too late for that conflict, was still serving in active military operations 60 years later. That is not the record of a near miss. That is the record of a genuinely great design. So what made it so good? What did those designers get right that so many of their predecessors had got wrong? The answer, I think, comes down to a few fundamental things. First, they started from the right requirements. By abandoning the false distinction between infantry tanks and cruiser tanks, by deciding that one machine had to do every job well rather than two machines, each doing one job adequately, they forced themselves to think holistically. Every decision about armor had to be balanced against mobility. Every decision about the gun had to account for the weight implications for the hull and the suspension. You cannot design a genuinely good universal tank by committee, because committees compromise. You design it by having a coherent vision and sticking to it. Second, they took reliability seriously in a way that British tank design had historically failed to do. The Meteor engine and the transmission system that went into the Centurion were not afterthoughts. They were central to the design philosophy. An unreliable tank is not just an annoyance. In combat, an unreliable tank is a death sentence. The crews knew it. The designers, by 1943, finally knew it too. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they built in adaptability. The turret ring was large enough to accept future gun upgrades. The hull was strong enough to carry additional armor. The basic architecture of the vehicle was sound enough to be improved over decades without requiring a complete redesign. This is an underappreciated virtue in weapon design. The best weapons are not necessarily the ones that are most optimized for a specific moment. They're the ones that can grow and change as circumstances change. The Centurion could grow, and it did. There is one more dimension to this story that we have not yet addressed properly, and it is perhaps the most poignant one. The men who designed the Centurion, who pushed for it, who argued its case in the face of institutional inertia and procurement timidity. Those men were, in many cases, the same men who had watched British tank crews die in inferior vehicles for years. They were not designing in the abstract. They were designing in the knowledge of what had happened in the desert, in Italy, in Normandy. They were designing with the weight of those losses on their shoulders. And they produced something magnificent, something that would have made a real difference in Normandy, would have saved lives, would have changed engagements. The historical counterfactuals are genuinely interesting. Centurions in the Bocage. Centurions at Villers-Bocage, where a handful of Tiger is devastated a British armored column. Centurions in the final push to the Rhine. The outcome of the war was not in serious doubt by mid-1944. Allied industrial production and manpower had by then created an advantage that Germany simply could not overcome, but the cost, measured in young men who did not come home, might have been different. It is a very human kind of irony. You work harder than you have ever worked, you solve every problem, you produce something genuinely exceptional, and the thing you were trying to prevent has already happened before you can deploy it. The Centurion story is ultimately a story about time, about the gap between the moment when you understand what is needed and the moment when you can deliver it. In peacetime, that gap is merely frustrating. In wartime, it is measured in lives. But it is also a story about persistence, about the quiet, unglamorous work of engineers and designers who kept going even when the feedback they were getting from the battlefield was devastating. Who took those lessons, absorbed them, and turned them into something better. And there is something else worth saying before we wrap this up. When the Centurion finally went to war, in Korea, in the Middle East, in Southern Africa, it justified every decision that had been made in its design, every compromise that had been refused, every shortcut that had been rejected. The crews who fought in it trusted it. They maintained it. In some cases, quite literally, they died in it rather than abandoning it because they knew that if they could keep it running, it would give them a fighting chance. That relationship between a crew and their vehicle is not something you can engineer directly. It emerges from accumulated trust, from the accumulation of many moments when the machine did what it was supposed to do, when it absorbed the hit and kept going, when the engine started on a cold Korean morning when a less reliable vehicle would have left them stranded. The Centurion earned that trust in the most demanding conditions imaginable. Over 50 years of operational service, in 6 different wars, on 3 different continents, in the hands of 10 different armies. Not bad for a tank that arrived too late. Not bad at all for something that was born out of frustration and failure. That came into being because enough people refused to accept that what they had was good enough, that represented the determination of a generation of British engineers to finally get it right. The Centurion never got to be the weapon that shortened the Second World War. That was the role it was built for, and history denied it that chance by the narrowest of margins. But it became something arguably more significant. Proof that the lessons of that war had been truly learned. Proof that the failures of the Crusader and the Comet and the Matilda had not been endured in vain. Proof that Britain, when it finally got its act together on tank design, could produce something as good as anything in the world. The 6 Centurions that crossed the Channel in May 1945 and drove into a Germany that had just surrendered. Those crews did not fire their guns in anger. They drove through a landscape of defeat and ruin and relief. They were part of a victory, but a victory that had been won by others, in vehicles that were, by the Centurion standards, not quite good enough. What those crews could not know, what none of them could have known in that moment, was that the machine they were driving would go on to have a longer and more distinguished combat career than almost any other tank of the 20th century. That it would fight real wars and win them. That it would be trusted by men in deserts and mountains and jungles who would stake their lives on its performance. They just drove through the ruins. And somewhere behind them, the war they had been built to fight was finally over. That is the story of the Centurion. And it is, I think, one of the most remarkable stories in the history of armored warfare. Not because it ended in triumph, though it did. Not because it was perfectly designed, though it came closer than most. But because it was born out of the worst kind of failure, forged in the knowledge of what inadequacy cost in human lives, and sent into the world just too late to do the one thing it had been made for. And then it went ahead and became legendary anyway. Thank you for watching. If this kind of deep dive into forgotten or underappreciated military history is the kind of thing you enjoy, then you know what to do. We have had a lot more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told properly.